The scary part about today's story is it could happen to anyone. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button one of those magic 8 balls that tells the future, but change all of the potential responses to reply hazy, try again. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On the night of October 25th, 2009, a fit, healthy 30-year-old man named Alex was at home in San Diego watching TV in bed. At some point, he noticed there was a slight pain in his left Achilles tendon. A tendon is the fibrous connective tissue that connects muscle to bone, and the Achilles tendon is the biggest tendon in your whole body, and it's the one you can feel on the back of your ankle. It connects your calf muscle to your heel. Alex had never had tendon pain before, and so he assumed it must just be tightness from the long walk he had taken that night around his neighborhood. And so after massaging it for a little while, eventually he kind of forgot about it and just kept watching TV until he fell asleep for the night. The next morning when Alex woke up, he immediately recognized that the pain in his left Achilles tendon was 10 times worse. It was blindingly painful. And then his right Achilles tendon was also now starting to hurt. And so he reflexively reached under the covers and tried to massage his sore tendons. But as soon as he touched the backs of his legs, he felt shooting pain in that area, and so he couldn't touch them anymore. And so instead, he swung his legs off the bed and he sat up on the edge of his bed. And then he slowly rocked forward until he transferred his weight onto his feet and tried to stand up. And as soon as he did, he fell to the ground because of the blinding pain in his tendons. And so he manages to pull himself back up using the bed. And then he hobbles his way out of his bedroom over to the top of the stairs. And then he grabs the railing and he carefully makes his way down the stairs. And as he's walking, it feels like the tendons are so tight, they're going to snap like a rubber band. And so he gets to the bottom of the stairs and he walks his way around into the kitchen, where he sits down and he kind of evaluates what's going on. And he thinks to himself, man, I must be developing a wicked case of tendinitis. Tendinitis is inflammation or irritation of the tendon. And so Alex grabbed his laptop, which was right in front of him. He opened it up and he began looking for ways to alleviate pain from tendinitis. And so after looking in a couple medical forums, he got up and hobbled his way over to the bathroom. He opened up the medicine cabinet and he grabbed the Icy Hot, which is a topical pain reliever. And then he hobbled his way into the first floor living room where he laid down on the couch, and then he applied a healthy amount of Icy Hot on the backs of both of his legs right over his tendons, and then he propped his legs up on 2 pillows. And so he laid there and he's thinking, okay, so it's the weekend, I have today off, I'll just lay here until the pain subsides. But by that evening, the pain had not subsided, it had gotten progressively worse. And so Alex picked up the phone and he called a podiatrist, which is a doctor who specializes in feet and the lower half of your leg, and he made an appointment for the following morning to have a look at his Achilles tendons. And so after he hung up, Alex thought to himself, the best thing I can do is probably just go to bed. I'm bound to feel better in the morning. And so Alex hobbles his way back up the stairs, holding onto the railing, and he goes into his bathroom to wash his face. He reaches for the towel and he notices his thumb is suddenly locked up and he can't move his thumb. And then his other thumb too locks up and he's looking at them and he can't get them to move. And so with his other fingers, he tries to move that thumb and bend that thumb, but he can't do it. The tendon in both of his thumbs had suddenly become unbelievably tight to the point where he couldn't move his thumbs anymore. Up until this point, Alex had convinced himself that whatever was happening with his Achilles tendons was probably minor, that with or without medical intervention, it was bound to just get better. But now he wasn't so sure, because the thumb situation, that really scared him. He had never experienced anything like that, and he couldn't help but think that whatever was happening in his thumbs was probably what was happening in his Achilles, making this a much more complex problem. So Alex forgets about washing his face or even going to bed, and instead leaves the bathroom and grabs the railing and hobbles back downstairs. He makes his way into the kitchen with the stiff thumbs, and he sits down at the table. He opens up his laptop and he begins looking for any information about what is happening to him. A few minutes into his search, he was about to type something into Google when all of a sudden he felt the rest of his fingers start to lock up. The tendons in his fingers were tightening up just like his thumbs and just like his Achilles tendons. And so now Alex is going into crisis mode. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He has no idea what to do, but he manages to calm himself down, and he told himself, Alex, tomorrow you got a doctor's appointment. They'll know what's wrong with you. They will fix this. Everything's going to be just fine. And so despite his overwhelming urge to panic, he closes his laptop and he hobbles his way over to the stairs. He climbs up to the second floor and he goes directly into his bedroom, crawls in bed, and he goes to sleep. The next morning when he woke up, the tightness and pain in his Achilles tendons and in his hands had not gotten any worse. And that kind of comforted Alex. He's thinking, okay, we're past the worst of this. I just need to figure out what this is and then fix it. And so he crawled out of bed, he hobbled his way over to the stairs, he went down, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he went outside to his car to head out to his doctor's appointment. When he got to his car, he reached for the door handle, and when he pulled on it, he felt an unbelievable surge of pain in the hand that was on the car. And when he looked down, all of the joints in that hand that had been pulling on the car, they had all separated. Like the connective tissue that kept his finger whole was no longer strong enough. So Alex screamed and he retracted his hand in horror, and when he looked at it, the joints had gone back to normal, but the pain in this hand persisted. And so on adrenaline alone, Alex managed to use his other hand and got the car door open. He went inside, and then he could barely grip the steering wheel because one hand is now wrecked and his other hand is not much better, but he managed to speed to the doctor's office. And then when he got inside, he could barely fill out the paperwork because one hand was wrecked and the other wasn't much better, so he couldn't grip the pen. But after he gave them his paperwork, the doctor finally came out and they brought him back to an exam room, and that's when Alex explained that originally it was just his Achilles tendons. That's why he had called for this appointment. But after making that appointment, not only had the pain in his Achilles gotten much, much worse, but there was also now pain and tightness in his hands, including one hand that had just fallen apart when he tried to open a door. Alex told the doctor that he had never experienced anything even remotely resembling this in his entire life. He led a very healthy lifestyle and really had no idea what could be causing this. Although he did say 10 days prior, he had finished a round of antibiotics. The drug was called Cipro, but previously he had used this drug with no issues. But as a precaution, he told the doctor because he knew one of the side effects of this drug was tendon problems. And so as a precaution, Alex had actually brought the paperwork for that drug, Cipro, and he gave it to the doctor. And so the doctor, after hearing the story, he reads through the fact sheet of this drug, and he tells Alex that he doesn't think it's a side effect of the drug. He thinks Alex is showing all the signs of having an autoimmune disease, like lupus or multiple sclerosis, and that he needs to go to a rheumatologist and get tested for that. And so Alex is horrified by this. He can't believe that only a couple of days ago, he was totally normal, and now it felt like his whole life was falling apart. And so he left that appointment, he went out to his car, and he called a rheumatologist, and he set up an appointment for a couple of days later to get tested, and then he went home. And over the next couple of days, as he waited for that next appointment, his condition only got worse. Every muscle, joint, and connective tissue in his body was either extremely tight or hurt or both. By the time he made it to the rheumatologist's office, he could barely move on his own. After the doctor had run several tests on Alex, Alex began mentally preparing himself to be told that he had an autoimmune disease. He believed at this point that that was the most logical explanation for what was happening to him. But when the test results came back in, to Alex's shock, he was negative across the board. He did not have an autoimmune disease. And so Alex hobbled out of the office, he got out to his car, he sat down, and he was in pain and at a loss. He had no idea what was happening to his body, and it seemed like none of the experts knew either. And so when Alex got back to his house, he made his way into the kitchen and he sat down to do some more research, but he felt like he was at a loss there too. He didn't even know what to research. He had searched for every possible combination of pain, tightness in your Achilles, pain, tightness in your hands and your fingers, and nothing was lining up with his experience. And so he thought to himself, even though that podiatrist ruled out the antibiotic he had taken a cycle of before he started feeling the way he was feeling, even though he ruled that out, I might as well do some more research on it because it's the one thing I can point to that was newly introduced to my life before I had all these things happen to me. And so he opened up his laptop and he typed in Cipro side effects. and what he discovered horrified him. Cipro is part of a class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones, and while it is a very effective antibiotic, it comes with extremely severe side effects. And enough people who have taken a fluoroquinolone have suffered from these side effects that there's actually a term given to them. They are said to have been floxed. And as Alex discovered in his research, there are many online communities for these floxed individuals, many of which used to be healthy and fit, but after taking these drugs, they became bedridden or had to transition to a wheelchair. This is due to one of the nastiest side effects of this class of drug: ruptured tendons. As a reminder, a tendon connects muscle to bone. And so if you were to say a tendon has ruptured, what you're actually saying is the muscle has torn off of the bone. And apparently this is unbelievably painful and almost always requires surgery to fix. And in many of these floxing cases, the fluoroquinolone drugs cause these people's tendons to start dramatically tightening until they just start rupturing. And there's nothing they can do to stop it unless they stop moving, hence becoming bedridden and transitioning to wheelchairs. When Alex read all these horrible testimonials of people who had been floxed, he realized their experience mimicked his own. He was floxed. But once he knew what he was up against, he began looking for a timeline. How long would he have these symptoms for? And what he saw was most people experience these awful symptoms for about 3 months and then they fade away. So for 3 months, Alex suffered, but he stayed positive. He was certain he was going to get better. But 3 months came and went, and he didn't get better. In fact, he got worse. All of his tendons continued to tighten, and some of them ruptured, and he had to quit his job and had to move in with his parents. But he stayed positive. He went back online, and he began reading about more severe floxing cases, and he saw those people typically saw a big turnaround at the 3-year mark. And while that was overwhelming and awful and disheartening, he at least had something to look at as the light at the end of the tunnel. And so for 3 more years, he waited and waited in pain. He eventually became completely bedridden and completely dependent on his parents. But then the 3-year mark came and went, and much like the 3-month mark, nothing got better, he just got worse. And that was when Alex realized he was in the range of people that suffered from their floxing permanently. In 2016, so 7 years after taking that fateful dose of Cipro, he wrote a blog post on his website updating the world about his condition. In it, he says he's only gotten worse and that his life effectively came to an end in 2009 when, over a 6-day period, he swallowed those 12 Cipro pills. And so now all he looks forward to is his death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please gift the like button one of those magic 8 balls that tells the future, except replace all of the potential answers with reply hazy, try again. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories that each have a very iconic, disturbing photograph that is tethered to that story. And at the end of each of these stories, I'll show you that photo. And some of these photos are truly astounding. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to host the like button at your house for a big dinner party. But when they show up, don't let them inside. Instead, simply tar and feather them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of October 21st, 1990, a 30-year-old man named Lee Hunsho and 3 of his friends hiked up Bilu Mountain, which is located in northern Taiwan. Now, by this point, the group had already been hiking for several hours, and so they were quite tired. I mean, Lee's legs absolutely burned, but Lee and the others kept on pushing until they reached the top of this rocky ridge. They all stopped and were able to catch their breath for a minute. So Lee was a bank manager, but he was also a very outdoorsy person, and he'd been wanting to do this hike up Bilu Mountain for a long time, because it was sort of like a rite of passage for hikers in Taiwan. It took an average of almost 8 hours to get to the top and back down again, and the terrain could be really rough. As a result, it was considered one of the most challenging hikes in all of Taiwan. But despite that, it was also a major tourist destination that was usually really busy, with lots of people attempting to do this hike. But on this particular day, for whatever reason, the friends had not seen anybody else on this trail. No one. And I mean, the weather was good, it was a weekend. I mean, there was really no good reason for nobody to be here, but they had the mountain to themselves. So Lee and his friends, they stood on this rocky ridge and caught their breath. They had some water, they had a couple of snacks, and then it was onward because they were not at the summit yet. I mean, this was a beautiful lookout point they were at, but they still had some pretty difficult climbing ahead. And so on they went, very excitedly. They're making their way towards the top. This is something they were all really excited about. And eventually they reached this section of the mountain that was sort of famous amongst tourists because it was a really, really steep section where the only way to get up was actually to climb a rope. There was a rope anchored into the mountain where, hikers had to grab the rope and walk and pull themselves up this section. It was like this kind of cool part that made you feel really rugged. And so when the men got to the spot, they all wanted to make sure there was a picture of them navigating this particular terrain. And so one by one, each of the men got on the rope and sort of paused at some point and turned around and made sure to get a cool picture of themselves making this really difficult section of the climb. And then once they had all taken their picture, they actually went the rest of the way up the rope and continued all the way up to the summit. And once they were on the summit, the friends actually didn't spend a whole lot of time there. I mean, remember, it takes almost 8 hours to do this entire round trip. And so you're sort of fighting against the darkness. You want to get back down before the sun goes down. And so they were up there long enough to get a couple of pictures and, again, to take stock of the fact that basically no one is here. In fact, literally nobody is here but them. It just seems sort of surreal. This is such a beautiful place, such a popular place. Why is nobody here? But didn't matter. They got their pictures, they got their beautiful scenery, they had some more water and snacks, and then they began making their descent. Now, on the way up, the friends had all been together. There was no separation. They were all, one by one, navigating each part of the terrain and making their way up together. But on the return trip, they got pretty separated, in part because Lee was really dragging behind. He was just so tired from the ascent that he sort of told the others, like, hey, go ahead, like you can walk ahead of me. We all know where we're going down and we'll meet at the car, so just go on ahead. And so Lee's friends had done just that. They had sort of taken off and gotten a bit of a lead on Lee. And so after a couple of hours of the group sort of broken up, making their way down the mountain, the friends in the front, who had left Lee behind effectively, they stopped at a certain point and they realized like they were really huffing it down the mountain, moving really quickly. And they thought, you know what? Lee was really tired up there. Maybe we ought to just sit here and wait for a minute and let him catch up, and then we'll make the final stretch together. And so the friends, they stop. And again, they're sort of looking around thinking how weird it is that nobody else is here but them. Like still, no one's come up the mountain. No one's come down the mountain. It's just them. It's very odd. They're sitting there waiting and they're looking back up the trail, expecting Lee to show up anytime, but he doesn't. And so eventually one of the friends says, you know what, you guys stay here. I'm gonna go back up the mountain a little ways and just see if I can catch Lee and just walk with him back down. I'm sure he's just exhausted and, I'll help him sort of finish up the hike here. And so this one friend, he begins going back up the trail. And for quite a while, he's basically hiking back up the mountain. And the whole time he's expecting he's gonna run into Lee. He has to. I mean, there were other trails that spidered off on the way down. So it was possible to take a wrong turn and sort of accidentally go down the wrong path. But for the most part, it was pretty linear. But as he's going up, he has not found Lee. And after a while, he's been hiking for like an hour back up the mountain and still no Lee. And he thinks, you know what, I can't do this. It's getting dark out. I have to go back and catch up with the other friends and just go down to the car because at this point, it seems pretty likely that Lee must have gotten turned around and he must have taken one of those other pathways. And now he's probably ahead of me. He's probably down at the car by this point. And so this friend who had done the rescue mission turned around, went back down, linked up with the other friends that were still sitting there waiting for him. Together, they walked all the way down the trail and they got to the car. And when they got there, they're expecting to see Lee, but he wasn't there. And by now, the sun had basically set. And so the friends realized that, okay, like we have a real problem here. I mean, clearly Lee didn't just get lost. He's still on the mountain somewhere. And like, what are we gonna do? It's about to be nighttime. Like, we can't go up there looking for him. And so they hopped in their car and they drove to the nearest police station to tell them to go look for Lee. And sure enough, there would be this huge search that was launched for Lee. And over the coming week, I mean, there were all these people out scouring the mountain looking for Lee, but they couldn't find him. And after a week of searching, the police had to call it off. And so Lee's friends and family were left with this huge question mark. Like, where did he go? What happened to him? I mean, the not knowing was in some ways worse than having found out he had died or something. And so there's this horrible uncertainty. Nobody really knows how to react to this. Do you grieve his loss now, or do you hold out hope that maybe he's still alive? Well, the friends and family kind of did the latter. They kind of held out hope that, maybe he's out there somewhere. And weeks turned into months, and eventually 4 months went by. And it was at that point that other hikers who were making their way up the mountain, they went off the trail on purpose. They were sort of off the trail for a bit, and they came across Lee's body. Now, the immediate reaction was obviously devastation for Lee's family and friends, but at least it seemed like they were going to get closure about what actually happened to Lee. However, when police began to investigate what actually killed Lee and why, they ran into a lot of anomalies. Number one, they did an autopsy and they couldn't figure out what killed him. There was no clear cause of death. Number two, where he was found, he was just kind of sitting there, with his back against the mountain. His pack was right next to him. It almost seemed like he just sat down and then just died in place. But again, there's no clear cause of death. There was no obvious, trauma he sustained. It certainly didn't seem like he fell. He didn't appear to have any obvious injuries. He just stopped at some point on the mountain and died. And on top of that, remember, Lee is like a seasoned climber. He had supplies in his bag that could at least last him for some time. He had a flashlight, he had a compass. He knew where he needed to go, down the mountain to the car. Why is he stopping? Again, no injuries, no clear injuries. Why is he stopping right there until he dies? It just didn't add up. But then there was another very strange development that sort of took the story in a totally new direction. One of the friends who was with Lee on that doomed hike, the one who had the camera that took pictures of all of them climbing up that rope and took pictures up on the summit, he went and got his pictures developed shortly after Lee had been found dead. And when he went through the photos from their trip, he could not believe what he found. Here is the photo of Lee posing with that rope. And if you notice, at the top of this segment, there's a person clearly up there looking down at Lee and his friends. But remember, they didn't see anybody else on the mountain the entire time they were there. And they certainly did not see that appears to be a young girl in a red jacket, right at the top of the segment they were in when they were taking those photos. They didn't see her. They would have absolutely communicated with her, but they didn't see her. And so they have this photo of this girl in Lee's picture, but she wasn't in any of the other photos. She was just in Lee's. And making this even stranger is there was this myth about this mountain, that there were these spirits on this mountain that would sometimes target hikers and lead them astray away from their friends off the trail, where effectively they would die. And wouldn't you know it, it seemed an awful lot like Lee was led astray and just sort of sat down and died on the mountain shortly after that picture captured this girl in red looking down at him. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. As an adult, I have found the holiday season can sometimes be sort of depressing. And I think the reason for that is nostalgia. I find myself looking back at my childhood when I had no responsibilities and I basically just got given presents and had wonderful food and family and friends around. And I look back at that and I think, that's what the holidays are about. Why can't I have that? Now I have bills to pay and I have a job and I have responsibilities. It doesn't feel magical. It feels stressful and kind of sad. But I'm here to tell you that there's a solution. And it's not to go back in time. It's instead to just be present. Be present in the moment. Appreciate what you have. Things have changed, no doubt, but that's okay. Change is okay. You just can't be stuck in the past. You need to be in the present. So if you want to slow down, reflect, and reset this December, BetterHelp makes it really easy to start talking with a therapist. BetterHelp accepts both HSA and FSA cards, making it even easier to prioritize your mental health. In 2024 alone, over 137,000 people used their HSA or FSA benefits for therapy through BetterHelp. So be sure to use yours before they expire. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballin to get 10% off your first month. On the morning of August 8th, 2024, a 48-year-old Russian woman named Lyudmila Lazarenko sat on the floor of a bungalow deep in the Amazon rainforest in Peru. The bungalow was small and mostly just for sleeping, but it was connected to a communal kitchen and dining space. Lyudmila sat right in the middle of the bungalow on the floor, with her eyes closed and her legs crossed, and she was trying to meditate, but the sounds of the birds and the insects outside in the rainforest, plus the sound of her friend, Ivan Kuzmin, who was moving around in the attached kitchen, were making it hard for her to concentrate. And so Lyudmila finally gave up on meditating for right now, and she opened her eyes and she looked out towards the kitchen, and she saw her friend, Ivan, who was 38 years old and from Ukraine, and he was busy brewing some tea. So Lyudmila and Ivan genuinely were just platonic friends. In fact, Lyudmila, she was married and had 2 kids, but she was out here alone. She and Ivan were actually part of what was a retreat out in the Amazonian rainforest with other people from all over the world who would come out here to meditate in nature and do some soul searching and hopefully come back to their regular lives with some additional perspective. Now, Lyudmila and Ivan had been going to retreats like this for the better part of 2 years, and that was actually how the two had met each other. And so they were just friends. They had this similar interest in going to retreats like this one. But there was one aspect of these retreats that really is the thing that drew Lyudmila and Ivan out to the rainforest. It was not just to sit in nature and just hope for the best. They would go to these ayahuasca retreats, where basically they were led through this meditative process where they would drink this very special tea that would sort of affect you in different ways. And, some people believed it sort of led you on this spiritual journey where, it's just this very powerful, soul-searching event where you come out of this thing feeling like a different person. If you've had trauma in your life, or you have, post-traumatic stress, or maybe you have trauma in your life that you're not even aware of, going through this style of retreat, these ayahuasca retreats, people have said has been very powerful and transformative. And Lyudmila, she lived a pretty typical life back home. She's a very busy mom and a wife, and she found doing these retreats really offered her a big reset. She felt like it was the one chance for her to kind of disconnect from responsibility and just be at peace. And Ivan, for the most part, felt very much the same way. He came to these retreats for similar reasons for his own life. And so here they are, they're out in the rainforest, and they're brewing up some tea, some ayahuasca tea, and they're in this bungalow and they're getting ready to have this sort of meditative journey, but they were about to break a very important rule. So the man who ran this particular retreat out in this part of the rainforest, he made it explicitly clear to everybody who came out there that no matter how many times you've come to these retreats or similar retreats, you never, ever drink the ayahuasca without a shaman present. Basically, without somebody else there to sort of help guide you through this process. If you were to do it on your own, who knows what could happen? And so everybody knew you cannot do this on your own. But Lyudmila and Ivan, they felt like, I get it. We're not supposed to do that. We know that. But we've done this so many times and we know what we're doing. So let's just brew up some ayahuasca of our own and we'll stay in our bungalow and we'll drink it ourselves. We'll have our own experience. Nobody will even know. And so that's what Ivan was doing in the kitchen. He was making ayahuasca tea. And when he was done, he grabbed 2 mugs of this tea. He walked back over to Lyudmila, who was in the bungalow section. He sat down next to her. They drank their tea and they both laid down on the ground and closed their eyes. A couple of hours later, The director of this retreat, who at the time was directing some group meditation not very far away from the bungalow where Ivan and Ludmila were. He was doing this group meditation when he heard a loud scream, and it was coming from somewhere near the bungalows. And instinctively, he got up, he abandoned the group he was with, and he ran to the scream. And he saw one of his staff members. She was the one who screamed, and she was standing looking into the bungalow where Ivan and Ludmila were. And so the director rushes over and gets right next to this woman, and he looks into the bungalow. And immediately, he knew two things. One, he knew for a fact these two, Ivan and Ludmila, had broken the rule. They had taken ayahuasca without a shaman present. And two, they had paid a horrible, horrible price. So ayahuasca is not just some herbal tea. It is a very powerful hallucinogen. And that's the whole point. People go out into the rainforest for these retreats and drink this hallucinogen in order to basically have perspective on their lives that you can only get by, introducing this chemical and causing yourself to hallucinate. People talk about almost seeing themselves from the outside looking in and like having this deeply spiritual event where you come out of your trip, that's what it's called, feeling like, oh my goodness, I know myself better now because of the hallucinations I just went through. But critically, the reason you have to have a shaman present in these retreats is really for safety. Because sometimes when you take ayahuasca, you have a bad trip where you have all these hallucinations, but they're of horrible, terrifying things, but you can't differentiate them from reality. And so you're living in a nightmare. And a lot of times these bad trips, it feels like something's gonna happen to you. You're gonna get hurt in some way, or somebody else is gonna get hurt unless you act. But again, you're sort of out of your mind. And so you have these shamans present to protect you from yourself. But Ivan and Ludmila didn't have a shaman present. And so when they entered their trip, Ludmila was having a good trip, Ivan was not. He had a horrible trip. And in his trip, he believed that Ludmila had become possessed by evil spirits, and he needed to save her soul. And how was he gonna save her? Well, he took a metal bottle and beat her savagely, and then he went and got a knife from the communal kitchen and he proceeded to dismember her. That staff member who walked over and screamed, they looked in and saw Ivan looking at them, smiling, totally insane looking, still high on ayahuasca, and there are pieces of Ludmila all over the bungalow. Here is a picture that was taken of Ivan very shortly after that staff member discovered this bloodbath inside of the bungalow. Ivan is literally sitting on the ground, feet away from pieces of Ludmila. He's just murdered her savagely, and he's still absolutely tripping on ayahuasca. He looks like an absolute madman. Ivan would come down from his ayahuasca trip, and when he did, he immediately confessed to what he had done, and he was arrested for murder, and he is currently serving time in prison in Peru. Around 4 p.m. on August 20th, 1975, an 18-year-old boy named Michael McQuilkin hiked up a massive granite rock called Morro Rock, which is in Sequoia National Park in California. Michael's 12-year-old brother Sean and his 15-year-old sister Mary were also on this hike with him, but currently they were lagging way behind, and he could just tell it was because they were tired. Now, the hike to the summit of Morro Rock was only a quarter of a mile, like this is a pretty short hike, but it was really steep. And Michael, despite only being 18, was sort of a pretty seasoned climber. I mean, he had just hiked 200 miles through the Sierra Nevada mountain range all by himself. And so for him, this terrain was no big deal, but he knows his siblings are not big mountaineers, nor are they pretending to be. And so he thought, okay, I'll wait, I'll let them catch up. But as Michael waited, he started to notice that the sky was getting pretty dark. Now, he had checked the weather before coming out here, and there was not supposed to be a storm, but it was sort of undeniable that something's happening. This is not normal. It's getting pretty dark and windy. But Michael told himself that, you know what? Maybe there's just a little pocket of weather and it'll pass. This can't be a big deal. And then eventually his siblings finally caught up to him. And then together, just a couple of minutes later, they were right at the summit. Now, by the time they were on the summit, they're looking out and the view is spectacular. But now it's becoming increasingly apparent to all three of them that this weather system, whatever's rolling in here, is pretty big and pretty bad. This is not some passing little thing. The sky is like pitch black at this point. But before they left, they just wanted to take a quick picture. And so because they didn't have a tripod or anything, they actually had Mary just take a picture of Michael and Sean. It was the best they were going to do. They couldn't really get a group shot. And so Mary snaps a photo of the two brothers. And then after taking this photo, they put the camera away and they're about to begin their descent when suddenly, all around them, everything turns bright white and there's this loud cracking sound, and then Michael is thrown to the ground, and before he has any idea what's going on, he's looking over and he sees his brothers on the ground, his sisters on the ground, and in fact, he sees smoke coming off of Sean's back. And that's when he realized they had just been struck by lightning. Now, Michael didn't really know if he was badly hurt or not, but he was able to jump right to his feet and he felt like he was basically okay. And his sister also, she was able to stand up, and they're obviously both disoriented and shocked. But Sean, I mean, he's in a heap on the ground and is literally smoking. It seemed like he really took the brunt of this lightning strike. And so Michael and his sister, they scooped Sean up, and together they hustled down the mountain, they got in a car, and they rushed to the hospital. And somewhat unbelievably, despite taking effectively a near direct hit from a lightning bolt, Sean survived. I mean, he was covered in burns, but he and Michael and Mary all lived through this strike. But the reason we know about this lightning strike is not just because they survived. That's great, but that's not why we still talk about it today. The reason we still talk about it today is because of that picture that Mary took of Michael and Sean standing on the summit of this mountain. If you look at this picture, you can see that the two brothers, their hair is sticking up in all directions. And they noticed at the time that their hair was standing up, but they didn't know why. They thought it was kind of funny. That's why they're smiling in the picture. But what they didn't realize they were capturing in this photo is the very scary phenomenon that occurs when you're basically right about to be struck by lightning. The air around you, especially if you're in a very exposed spot, like the summit of a mountain, gets electrically charged and your hair stands up right before you're hit by the bolt. And so now this picture is now used by the National Park Service to show people what to be aware of when you're out hiking on these mountains. If your hair starts to stand up, you better move. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. The most famous street in arguably the most famous city in the world is Fifth Avenue in New York City. Also known as Millionaire's Row, Fifth Avenue is home to unbelievably wealthy and influential people, along with countless luxury stores and restaurants and museums. But what most people don't know about this incredible street is that it actually has a dark history. Specifically, it used to be home to something so awful, so terrifying, that it literally had to be destroyed. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice bag of chips, but be sure you crush the entire bag first. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors or police officers or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. And then finally at 2 a.m., he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it. And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the two brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off. But instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them. And when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside. Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly the door gave way, but it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the second floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the second floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time. He could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically, all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling, in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere, and lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn, where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother, Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day, as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him, But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was his skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only on the podcast. So again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. My wife is a total skeptic. She does not believe in the paranormal whatsoever and never has. But when I told her just a portion of today's story, specifically the part about the passenger in first class, you'll know when you get to that scene, she told me she was so intrigued by it. And I think the reason for that is in this story, as you'll see, there were so many witnesses, hundreds of witnesses. And so how could they all be making this up? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come over your house for a Ouija board session, and then after everyone has their fingers on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the like button, and then casually push the pointer towards no. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via 2 small elevators that could barely fit 1 person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which was the front left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down in the customary co-pilot seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining two members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only 2 seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive, there were 4 seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last 2 men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer. And despite him being this big, strong ox of a man, he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. And so Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Angelo was not actually part of that night's flight crew. However, he was an employee of Eastern Airlines, and that night he needed to get to Miami, and so the company had put him on Flight 401 and sat him in the 4th and final seat in the cockpit, right behind Captain Bob. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward and the plane began to take off. A few minutes later, and Flight 401 was airborne up in the night sky over New York, headed south towards Miami. For the next 2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers, named Jerry Escow, actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m., Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport, but when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have 3 pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb, inside the cockpit that once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed on, its green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed only 2 of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim. And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all 3 lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on. And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on, and so they would have to circle around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty. And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it. And when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the panel and kind of blew the dirt and grime off of it. And then they jammed it back into the panel. But as soon as they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways. And so they couldn't actually get it out again. And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all. We need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated. And so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot, and he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So the hellhole is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole, there is this window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear, and you could make sure it was down or not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in the Everglades, riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and miles and miles. Their only light source is Robert's headlamp. And so at some point, Robert turns off the airboat, and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side. And all around them, they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were. And basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash. And Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades straight in the direction of where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been, and Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 401, when Captain Bob turned around in his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent. But nobody noticed. Because, one, it was totally pitch black outside, the Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that night, and so when they're looking out the window, there would have been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky. It would have felt like they were just cruising as expected. And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit telling them they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, they were now going down, nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into the hellhole, the plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. and when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there, and even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out because the swampy wetlands had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern and just kind of coasted until it hit the ground. And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were, and that ultimately saved lives. In fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground, but many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene, Robert lifted up his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw, and it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles, and this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned. And so Robert and his friend, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water, saving this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people as they possibly could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters, and they, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people to safety as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was working perfectly fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were killed in the crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the cockpit to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. I was recently eating lunch with a friend of mine in Uskapog, Rhode Island, when he asked me, "John, what is your biggest dream in life?" Now, ever since I was a literal newborn baby, I've had a huge dream, but I've always been too scared to commit to it. But for some reason, when my friend in Uskapog asked me this question, I felt this euphoria growing inside of me, and then before I could stop myself, I blurted out the truth. I want to create a mildly effective... I want to make a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants. And then before my friend could react to this revelation, I turned and leapt headfirst out the glass window.
And then when I hit the ground, I turned around expecting to see my friend angry and staring down at me, ready to fight me. But instead, he was standing on our table doing a jig, stomping on our plates and our cups, and all around him, our waiters and waitresses were cheering, saying, "Go, John, go!" And so go I did. After a quick salute to the gang, I turned and I ran directly into traffic. And for 97 miles, I ran along the freeway until I got to Chicopee, Massachusetts, where I climbed up into a tree and I fired up my coal-powered laptop and I got to work on my business plan. But pretty quickly, I learned putting together a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants was going to be very time-consuming. And so where would I find the time to eat? And that's when I discovered HelloFresh, an amazing meal service that sends incredible food right to your doorstep. So if your schedule is packed this fall with school, with work, or with developing your own fire ant-related products, then let HelloFresh take care of your meals. They have a weekly selection of 30-plus recipes and 70-plus convenience items, including vegetarian, pescatarian, and fit and wholesome meals, which make it easy to stick to your goals. HelloFresh is also up to 72% cheaper than dining out at a restaurant or going grocery shopping. So if you're like me and plan on spending the fall in adult diapers chained to a chair working non-stop on your coal-powered computer, or you're just regular busy, then give HelloFresh a try. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallin16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Again, that's HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallin16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes and 3 free gifts. Okay, back to the story. For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine, and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the two women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those two elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other, and then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards. If you were to walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny has gotten back in the elevator and she's made her way back downstairs to continue looking for Denise. She gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen, and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut, so she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her, probably in the lounge area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of scanning behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick. And there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. And she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there. But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear, because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge, through that door, into the kitchen to get back to the elevators so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen, because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevators. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the car comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance, they both looked at each other, and Mildred could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale, she was sweating. And so Mildred said, "Ginny, are you okay? What's going on?" And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, "Ginny, you need to come with me." And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost. She was sweating and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of the strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone, and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and she went back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information. One month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, whose name was Sis, began counting the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by one. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to. And at least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead, and Sis introduced herself and asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly, and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face, because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft!" The same Bob Loft who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated, silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People are screaming and crying, and George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane, because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook and cranny of this flight to see if they could find this guy. But they never did. And so after a very long delay, plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and asked if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap. But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports, and apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing, and they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines' fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401. Some of these unexplained events included more sightings of the silent seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything, but when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger in coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure enough, the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401, despite the fact none of those parts were faulty. They were removing perfectly good parts, and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come over for a Ouija board session. And once everyone has their fingertips on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the like button and then subtly push the pointer towards no. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast that puts out brand new episodes that are exclusive to the podcast on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out remastered audio from our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is called Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to rewrite the ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallin.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called Mr. Ballin Shorts. The other is called Mr. Ballin en Espanol. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Both of those channels are just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @Mr. Ballin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today, we're going to look at 3 stories about real people who at some point in their lives made choices. Now, at the time, these choices were fairly innocuous, but eventually those choices would completely change not only their lives, but millions of other people's lives as well. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and change the names of all their contacts to just say spam, so that every call they get, they think it's spam and they don't answer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On January 17, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair. So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of the space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station, there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, and immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts,
He actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready, and then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan and his team to help them do that. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the chance to be huge, he just felt like they lacked something. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so this meeting that Dan was having right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What kind of campaign can we run for this company? And so for hours they sat there pitching different ideas, different concepts of how we can elevate this brand. But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least not yet. And so as Dan is beginning to get frustrated, realizing he really doesn't have any great ideas yet, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words: "Just do it." Dan's client, that small business, was Nike. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballin Studios called Redacted: Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories. One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do, and so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, is this okay? And she kind of looked back and smiled like, I get it, it's fine, we can eat here. So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table. And then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here. And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, sure, go ahead. And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, Chris, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't, and so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, what's going on? Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, what's going on here? He's looking at his date like, did I miss something? Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, you're an ugly pig. And at this, Chris is like, I can't just sit here. And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, hey man, get up, like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here. And he kind of looks up at this guy, and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date, and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point, and he kept apologizing to his date, and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there, and so they left the McDonald's, and they both, went to their respective homes, and Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning, when Chris got up early, because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom, and he looked in the mirror, and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good, but it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and By the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity and he left thinking, I'm not going to get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye. Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. I mean, he truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted was inside of his dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands on a bottle of gin, and so tonight they were just sitting around, drinking this gin and having a great time. Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. I mean, literally they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter that they were 21 years old. At the time, in the United States in 1925, the country was in the middle of prohibition, which meant no one was allowed to possess or consume alcohol. It was actually illegal. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was a senior in college and was getting ready to graduate with honors. And also, he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine called Jack-O-Lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. I mean, he had aspirations of graduating and becoming a professional writer and publisher, and it just felt like everything was falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories. It was a lot of fun, but at some point, they heard a knock on their door. And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my God, are we in trouble now? Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by and hang out with us. And so Ted, he gets up, he goes to the door, and his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there. He opens the door, and it's not friends, it's two police officers. And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail, and also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars, which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. In fact, he was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken, less so about the academic honors and much more so about being, cut off from the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow. Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published. And so that's exactly what Ted began doing, and the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from this pseudonym, they thought it was some new person they had never heard of. And they were so wowed by the work, they're like, this is great. And they began publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. And for Ted, oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name, kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this ruse for the rest of the time he was at Dartmouth, and then after he graduated, He just continued to write under this pen name. Throughout the rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books, all under this pen name, a name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college. These books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but I'm sure you know him much better by his pen name, which is Dr. Seuss. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mr. Ballin Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballinstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In South China, there is this 100-kilometer long wilderness trail called the MacLehose Trail. And at first glance, it just seems like a pretty normal, beautiful hiking trail, until you begin to research what other hikers have said about what they experienced out on that trail. Let's just say some of their experiences are genuinely terrifying. And today, I'm gonna tell you one of those experiences. It's about this man who goes solo hiking out on the MacLehose Trail, and he comes in contact with something that neither he nor anybody else can explain. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to mail the Like Button's very important, time-sensitive job applications for them. But instead of mailing them, just immediately put them in the trash. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of June 18th, 2016, a 45-year-old hiker named Zhang Shenpeng stood at the entrance to the famous MacLehose Wilderness Trail in southern China. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, aimed it at the trail, and took a photo. Now, this trail was very beautiful, which is why he was taking a photo of it, but it also had a reputation for being a very dangerous trail. It was located in an area called the Sai Kung Peninsula, and the trail itself was about 100 kilometers long, or 62 miles, and it went through forests and mountains and streams, and the weather along this trail was very unpredictable, with sudden storms rolling in and just wreaking havoc. But Zhang was feeling very confident about this hike because he himself was an experienced hiker. While he maybe hadn't done this particular trail, he had hiked similar trails, and also the weather appeared to be holding up. However, before Zhang could even take a step onto this trail, the sky suddenly turned this dark greenish hue, and there was a loud thunderclap. I mean, basically instantly, there was this massive storm overhead. Zhang couldn't believe it. He just stood there watching as this unbelievable storm rolled in, wondering what he should do. I mean, again, he had not prepared for a storm. It was supposed to be nice out. But as he's kind of weighing whether or not he should just turn around and head back home because it was now too dangerous, the sky, just as suddenly as this all began, cleared. And it was suddenly beautiful and bright out, and the storm was gone. Now, at first, Zhang was not entirely convinced that the storm was now just magically gone, and so for a few minutes, he just stood there waiting in case it came back. But it didn't. The sky remained beautiful and clear. And so eventually, Zhang posted that photo he had taken of the trail, and he captioned it with something to the effect of, very strange weather out here, but I'm continuing my hike. And then after posting the photo, he put his phone away and began walking down the MacLehose Trail. At first, as Zhang headed off into the forest, he made good time. It was warm out, but not too hot, and his pack was fairly light. And also, the views were just stunning. Every time he came to a rise on the trail, he could look out and see the waves of the South China Sea, and the air was so clear and crisp. I mean, it was a really relaxing and beautiful place to be. Certainly a big change from what he was used to, which was the noise and crowds of the city. And so Zhang just continued on his hike, stopping periodically to take more photos. But after about an hour of this hike, when things were still going really well, Zhang reached this fairly steep incline on the trail, and he began walking up it. There had been past inclines on the trail, and he had been fine. But as he began maneuvering up this particular incline, he began to feel kind of woozy. In fact, more specifically, he began to feel like the air all around him was getting really hot, like somebody was turning up the temperature all around him. And so Zhang, he stopped as he was making his way up this incline to kind of catch his breath. But as he did that, the heat just got worse and worse. He became delirious. And as he was almost towards the top of this hill, it was like he just couldn't go any further. And the world began to spin all around him. And before long, he was tumbling to the ground and blacking out. The next thing Zhang became aware of was the feeling of grass pressed up against his cheek. He was laying on the trail. So he kind of opened his eyes, he sat up for a second, he was very disoriented. He didn't know how long he had been out for. He figured it was only a couple of minutes. But as he kind of got his bearings, the first thing he noticed is the sky was now totally dark. And when he had passed out, it was broad daylight. And so he's thinking, that can't possibly be true. I can't have been here for hours. That's not possible. And so he began to think to himself like, oh, I guess another storm has rolled in. That's why the sky is so dark. It's not nighttime. But then when he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone and saw the time and saw it was 8 o'clock at night, he realized there was no storm. It really is nighttime. He had been unconscious on this trail for apparently like 12 hours. And so as Zhang just stared at his phone in disbelief, his phone began to ring, and it was his wife. And so Zhang's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm supposed to be home right now. My wife is definitely worried about me. And so pretty quickly, he kind of composed himself, even though, again, he has no idea what's happening here. And he answers the call, and as cheerful as he could, he told his wife that everything was fine, he was just running late, and he would be home soon. And so she said, okay. And then after Zhang hung up with her, he put his phone back in his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. And then he stood up and kind of checked himself over for cuts and scrapes and bruises. He had no idea what condition he was in here. But after checking himself over, he seemed okay. He was still very disoriented and confused, but physically he was okay. And then, again, even though he doesn't understand what's happening here, he's just thinking, okay, I gotta turn around, get back to the car, and get home as quickly as possible. So he slung his backpack, and with his flashlight out in front of him, he just started hoofing it back down the trail in the direction of his car. Now, as Zhang walked along, he was feeling very unsettled, but he kept telling himself that, independent of whatever's happened here, he was gonna be home soon, and everything was gonna be fine. However, not long into his return trip towards his car, he began to get this unbelievably bad feeling, like something was just totally wrong here. And as he began having this feeling, he suddenly took stock of the fact that the forest he was in, which had been so alive with life and sound and everything, was now completely silent. No insects, no animals. The stream nearby was making no sound. It was like he was in a void. And it was so eerie. And he stopped and just listened. And it was like the whole world was on mute. And so Zhang, who now was starting to feel scared, just began scanning his flashlight all around him, not even sure what he was looking for. But as he did, he had another realization. Suddenly the area he was in did not look familiar at all. He had only walked maybe several paces away from where he had just fallen to the trail and passed out. But now as he looked around, it was like he was in a totally different section of the forest. He looked back where he had fallen, and even in the grass where he would have been, it was untouched. There was no impression on the ground from where he would have been laying for 12 hours, like he'd been transported somewhere else without knowing it. Now, when Zhang spoke to his wife on the phone, he was very careful not to alarm her, even though he had sort of a growing sense of panic inside of him. But now, the whole situation was sort of out of hand. He really didn't understand what was happening, and he knew he needed help. And so he reached into his backpack to pull out his phone to call for help, except when he reached into his bag, there was nothing there. His phone was gone, his supplies were gone, the bag was totally empty, even though literally minutes before it had been full. Like there was no way he just randomly lost this stuff. It had been there, and now it was gone. And so Zhang desperately looked on the ground with his flashlight, and he walked back in the direction where he believed he had fallen, even though it didn't look like the same place. He's looking all over the place like, maybe he did drop his stuff, but he didn't. It was just gone. And so now, really feeling scared, Zhang just completely lost his composure and began screaming at the top of his lungs for help. But he heard nothing in response, just silence. And then not long after that, Zhang's head began to feel heavy again, and then he sank to the ground, put his head in the dirt, and he closed his eyes. Hey guys, I have an incredible announcement. Something I know is going to absolutely make your day. Something many of you may have waited years for me to say again. Beginning the first full week in the new year, so the week of January 5th, I am going to go from one measly upload on this channel a week to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. You heard that right. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 times a week. You guys have been telling me that you want me to release more videos, and well, I and our whole team have been listening. So as always, make sure your notifications are on so you don't miss any of these amazing extra weekly uploads. It will not replace what you're already getting. This is all in addition to. It's going to be great. See you guys soon. When Zhang woke up, it was bright out, and he also was now magically back at the original spot where he had passed out on that steep incline. And the first thing he did as soon as he came to is he reached into his bag, hoping that his phone and other supplies would have just materialized by now. But no, when he reached inside the bag, it was still empty. And so on the one hand, Zhang still is like, what is going on here? I don't understand what's happening. And then on the other, he was also becoming acutely aware that because he doesn't have his phone, he can't call for help, like he's stuck out here. And so he's wondering, like, what is he gonna do here? And then it dawns on him that, it's been at least several hours since he last spoke to his wife, and she was expecting him home the night before. And so by now, certainly, because he hasn't come home, she must have called the police. And so maybe there was already a search party out here looking for him. And so suddenly feeling kind of hopeful that that was actually happening, Zhang, despite his confusion and disorientation here, just scooped up his backpack, put it on, and began walking down the trail back in the direction towards his car. And as he walked, Zhang periodically would call out, hoping that again, some searchers or other hikers were nearby who would hear him and come to his aid. But after hiking for over an hour, he still had not reached his car. The forest was still eerily silent, like everything was silent. He hadn't seen or heard anybody else. I mean, he's totally alone here. And so Zhang started to wonder if maybe his best bet was not to try to hike out of here, but instead to just stay put and wait for, hopefully, the search party, if there was one out there, to come find him, or maybe some other hiker to come find him. However, as he was considering this, he looked up ahead where the trail kind of turned, and he saw there was this pond, a pond he had not seen on the way in, but nonetheless, there was a pond basically right over there. And from his perspective, he could see kind of through the trees on the other side of the pond appeared to be a person. Zhang suddenly felt this enormous sense of relief. Here was the person who was going to help him and get him out of here. And so Zhang began walking towards this person, and as he did, he cupped his hands and he called out a hello to get this person's attention. Now, when Zhang did this, he believed this person would either, 1, hear him, turn around and see what Zhang wanted, or 2, they wouldn't hear him, and they would just continue to stand there with their back to him. But neither of those things happened. When Zhang called out this very hearty hello, this person just instantly began sprinting away from Zhang without even turning to look at him. They just began taking off into the trees. And Zhang, he's thinking like this is a crisis for him. He has no idea what's happening here. This is the first person he's seen. He needs them. And so instinctively, Zhang just took off running after them, calling out the whole time, trying to reassure them that he was not a threat. He didn't mean to scare them. He needs their help. And so he gets to the pond. He runs around the perimeter. He can still see this person running off into the woods. And Zhang, like he's so exhausted from the lack of water and food, he's not feeling his best, but somehow through adrenaline alone, he starts gaining on this person. And eventually he closes the distance on this person as they're weaving through the trees. And suddenly this person just stops. And they don't turn around to look at Zhang, they just stop in the middle of the woods. And Zhang, he almost barrels into them because he had been running so quickly, and he too, he just stops.
and he's staring at the back of this person who still has not turned around to look at him at any point. And Zhang says to them, "Please, I need your help." And Zhang, he's panting, he's totally out of breath, and this person who's been running at top speed the whole time, they're not out of breath, they're not even moving, they're stationary, just with their back to Zhang. And suddenly, as Zhang is staring at this person, realizing that something feels off here, the person begins to turn around to look at him. And as they do, Zhang suddenly feels this incredible sense of dread. Like he chased this person down, he needs their help, but now that they're turning around to face him, something feels wrong and he doesn't want to see him, something's off here. And then the person fully turns around and looks at Zhang, and Zhang is suddenly so terrified of what he sees, he holds his breath and just stays there frozen to the spot staring. He can't believe what he's looking at. This was not a person. This was some sort of shadowy figure with no face, and it was now staring directly at Zhang. And Zhang, again, he's so scared he can't move, he's holding his breath, he's just looking right back at them, and then suddenly this figure takes an aggressive step toward Zhang, and then another, and another, until suddenly they're inches away from Zhang, and Zhang is so terrified, he just closes his eyes, expecting to die at any second, and then when he opens his eyes, the figure's just gone. For about 5 minutes, Zhang just stood there, shaking in utter disbelief of what he had just experienced. I mean, this whole thing had been terrifying, but this specific interaction with this shadow figure was horrifying, and he had no idea how to process it. But at the same time, after a few minutes, Zhang's thinking to himself, I don't want to stay around here to try to figure out what's going on. I need to get out of here. And so Zhang finally, after mustering the courage, he turns to start walking back towards the pond and back up to the trail. But when he turns around, the pond isn't there anymore. It's just this endless expanse of trees. The pond should have been right there, and it's gone. And also, when Zhang took off running after this shadow figure, it was daylight. And now, it's darkness. It's total darkness. And so once again, Zhang has somehow gone to a new location and jumped through time, several hours at least, with no idea how that had even happened. And also, as he's having this realization that once again, it's like space-time has changed all around him, he starts to have that heaviness in his head, things start to swim all around him, and before long, he's fallen to the ground and he's closing his eyes. When Zhang woke up again, it was now suddenly bright out. So again, more time has passed. He was not just passed out for a minute or two, it was several hours at least. And also, Zhang was now magically laying right next to the pond that had vanished the night before after this figure had showed up. And so at this point, Zhang is seriously thinking to himself that he must have lost his mind. That's what's happening here. He's gone insane. Or does he have some horrible head injury that's like causing hallucinations or something? Like, he doesn't know. But at the same time, all he can do at this point is just get up, try to get back to the trail, and try to get back to his car and get back home. That's all he can do. And so that's what he did. Zhang made his way back up to the trail and began walking down the trail in the direction that he believed was back towards his car. But after hiking for a while, things did not look any more familiar. It was like he was hiking down a brand new trail that he had never been on before. The forest continued to be eerily silent, and every time he called out for help, he got nothing in response. And then eventually, Zhang reached a section of the trail that kind of sloped down, and when he got there and he looked out ahead of him, he saw down below there was this huge cemetery. Now, Zhang had studied this entire area before coming out on this hike, and he knew there was no cemetery in the middle of the MacLehose Trail. Like, this can't be here. But remember, by this point, Zhang has seen and experienced things that he cannot understand. So he doesn't even know what's real and what's not anymore. And so as he's looking at the cemetery, he told himself, this has got to be some hallucination. This can't be here. But after walking down the hill and entering the cemetery, he reached out and touched the headstones, and they were very real. This cemetery absolutely, for right now anyways, was real and right in front of him. And as he looked at the dates on these headstones, he could tell the cemetery was at least 200 years old. And so as Zhang is taking in this new information, he looks up and he sees a couple hundred meters away from him is a group of what appears to be people clustered around a grave. And for a moment, Zhang feels this unbelievable sense of relief. Here we go, there's some people here, they're visiting their relatives, they can help me. But before Zhang ran over there and asked for their help, he watched one of them sort of turn their bodies and they looked back at Zhang. And instantly Zhang's body was overcome with terror once again. because this person was not a person. This was a faceless, dark figure, just like the one he had encountered near the pond. And there was this horrible sense that this thing was looking right at him. And so horrified, Zhang just turned and ran away. That night, Zhang found himself inexplicably back at that small pond. Didn't even know how he got there, but at this point, he wasn't questioning anything because he didn't understand any of this. And as he was next to this pond, at some point, he had that heaviness come over him, and before long, he was on the ground, closing his eyes. However, this time, as he sort of slept or became unconscious, he entered into this sort of dream state where he became aware that there were whispers all around him. Somebody or something was trying to communicate with him, and at first he couldn't tell what it was. But then he realized it was like the earth was talking to him. It was like the rocks and the nearby water were literally speaking to him. And for some reason, this felt sort of comforting, even though again, he has no idea what to make of this. And then when Zhang woke up again, it was bright out, and all of a sudden Zhang was aware that the forest was alive again. There were sounds coming from everywhere, animals, insects, there was water sounds. It was like things were back to normal. And Zhang, he also had this incredible clear-headedness that he hadn't had for the past several days. It really was like things had gone back to normal. And so Zhang stood up, and he heard the sound of running water nearby, and he followed it to a stream. And so he decided he would just follow this stream right on out of the MacLehose Trail. Like this was going to be the way he would get out of here. But after walking for hours and hours along the stream, he still had not found his way out. The sun was now directly overhead, beaming down on him. He was so hot, he was tired, he was moving slower and slower. His optimism was beginning to fade. And then he looked up, and just up ahead, he saw something that destroyed any of the optimism he had left. Because right up ahead were 3 more shadow figures with their back to him. It was like they were blocking his way towards freedom. And so as Zhang tensed up and prepared to turn and run back deeper into this trail that he was trying to escape, one of these shadow figures turned, and they looked directly at Zhang. And when they did, everything changed. Because Zhang instantly realized this was no shadow figure. This was a real person. They had a face, and they were calling out to him saying, "Hey, do you need any help?" And Zhang was so relieved, so happy. He couldn't even say anything back. He just fell to his knees and wept tears of joy. He was finally saved. It would turn out Zhang's wife had called the police on that first night when Zhang didn't come home. And so the whole time Zhang was out in the woods over these several days, there was actually a massive search party out there looking for him. However, none of the searchers claimed to have seen or heard Zhang at any point, and Zhang did not see or hear any of the searchers. Those people at the end who finally rescued him were just random hikers that happened to see him. But somehow, despite the fact that Zhang really could not have gone very far from his car, I mean, he really didn't cover a huge distance on this trail when this whole experience began, despite that, the searchers never heard or saw Zhang at any point, and Zhang obviously never heard or saw any of them. So they're basically in the exact same area, looking for each other, but nobody sees each other. After being discovered by those 3 real people on MacLehose Trail, Zhang was taken to a hospital where he was examined, and it was determined there was nothing physically wrong with him other than he had not had much to eat or drink in several days. In fact, the official explanation for what happened to Zhang was just that he was really dehydrated. However, Zhang didn't buy that explanation. And when Zhang left the hospital and got back home, he immediately began digging into the history of the MacLehose Trail, and he would quickly discover that he was not the first person to have a totally wild, bizarre, borderline paranormal experience out on that trail. It would turn out the MacLehose Trail cuts across a geographic line called the Sai Kung Barrier. This is an area of the Sai Kung Peninsula that is generally considered to be a portal to other dimensions. And there have been enough people to have otherworldly experiences out on this trail that loosely match what Zhang claims to have seen and experienced, that they dubbed the area this trail is in as the Bermuda Triangle of South China. And adding even more intrigue to this area is the fact that several other very experienced hikers have gone missing along this trail, and they've had huge search parties sent out for them, but they were never found. Zhang would eventually share his story of what happened to him out on the trail in a 3,500-word essay that he posted on social media. He, and many others, believe that when he first fell and collapsed on the trail, that he actually fell through the Sai Kung Barrier and entered another dimension. that for those days that he was wandering around having no idea what was happening to him, that he wasn't really in this dimension anymore. He was somewhere else. Zhang believed the only reason he was able to escape this other dimension was because on his final night in this other place, he began to hear the sounds of the rocks and the water whispering to him. He said the only reason he was able to hear that was because he had sort of accepted his fate, that here he was in this totally strange world that he couldn't understand and didn't have any real expectation to escape from. And it was that sort of resignation that he allowed himself to feel that kind of put him in touch with this dimension, and he believes that's what ultimately allowed him to come back home. Despite those who doubt him, Zhang stands by his version of events. While his time on the trail did not cause him any physical harm, to this day he is still haunted by it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.